There are places in Charleston, South Carolina, where the land itself feels like it remembers, where the ground seems to hold memories that no storm or flood could ever cleanse, and where certain truths remain hidden beneath layers of clay, roots, and passing years. In the spring of 1847, city surveyors began recording something that contradicted every natural principle they believed they understood. Across 7 separate plantations scattered throughout the Low Country, from the banks of the Ashley River to the Cooper, from the Sea Islands to the deep inland swamps, they encountered slave quarters that all shared a single, deeply unsettling trait. No rats made homes in their walls. No snakes coiled beneath their floorboards. No insects crept through the cracks of their foundations. These buildings stood untouched by vermin, as though the natural world itself had drawn an invisible line that no living creature was willing to cross. The surveyors carefully noted this anomaly in their official records, but those papers were quietly set aside, stamped with the words "Administrative Review Pending," and never released to the public. What city officials uncovered inside those quarters was judged too disturbing, too dangerous for the fragile social balance of the antebellum South. But truth has a way of forcing itself to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. And the reality of what truly happened inside those structures, what bound them together, what drove animals away, and what it cost the people forced to live within those walls, reveals something far more chilling than any ghost story ever told. Before we continue with the account of Charleston's silent quarters and the surveyor who refused to allow the truth to remain hidden, I need you to do one thing. If you're drawn to real historical mysteries that blur the boundary between documented fact and deeply unsettling reality, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. This channel explores the darkest corners of American history, the stories intentionally forgotten, the truths powerful people tried to erase. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Let's see just how far these forgotten stories can travel. Now, let's return to Charleston in 1847 and meet the man who would spend 3 years of his life unraveling a mystery that would haunt him until his final breath. Charleston in that year was a city of stark contradictions, a place where immense wealth existed beside profound suffering, where elegant mansions with sweeping piazzas and manicured gardens stood within sight of auction blocks where human beings were bought and sold. The city's prosperity rested on rice, indigo, and cotton, and that wealth had given rise to an aristocracy that prided itself on refinement, education, and what they proudly called civilization. Streets were paved with ballast stones hauled from distant ports. Gas lamps cast their glow along the main thoroughfares. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang out over a city that viewed itself as a jewel of the South. Yet beneath this polished surface lay a system built on relentless brutality. The Low Country plantations surrounding Charleston were among the most profitable in the nation and among the deadliest. Rice fields filled with stagnant water and swarming malarial mosquitoes claimed the lives of enslaved workers at rates that shocked even hardened overseers. The task system used in the region was often described as more humane than the gang labor common on inland cotton plantations, but remained a structure founded on stolen freedom, shattered families, and lives valued only in economic terms. Into this world arrived Elias Vance, the surveyor and civil engineer from Philadelphia. In the spring of 1847, he was 32 years old, of average height, with dark hair already beginning to gray at the temples and eyes his colleagues described as unsettlingly attentive. Vance had studied at the University of Pennsylvania under some of the finest scientific minds of his era. He had mastered not only the practical skills of surveying, the use of theodolites and chains, the calculation of angles and distances, but also geology, chemistry, and what was then known as natural philosophy. He viewed the world through the lens of scientist skepticism paired with a reformer's conscience. Vance came to Charleston reluctantly. His firm in Philadelphia had secured a contract with the city to conduct a comprehensive survey of properties throughout the surrounding Low Country. The project was intended to establish clear boundaries for taxation, resolve disputes between neighboring plantations, and create accurate maps of a region that had developed in a piecemeal fashion over more than a century. It was routine work, financially rewarding but intellectually uninspiring. Vance accepted the assignment largely out of necessity. His father had died the previous year, leaving behind debts that Elias felt honor-bound to repay. He arrived in Charleston on a humid April morning, when the air was heavy with the fragrance of Confederate jasmine, and the harbor was crowded with ships from across the globe. He took a room in a boarding house on Church Street, operated by a widow named Mrs. Talbert, who was known for keeping a respectable establishment and asking very little of her guests. The room was small but tidy, with a window overlooking a garden where camellias bloomed in abundance. Vance spent his first weeks in Charleston inside city offices, poring over existing property records and maps. The documents were in disarray, some dating back to original colonial land grants, others hastily sketched during property transfers, many contradicting one another in critical ways. He quickly understood that the survey would take far longer than his firm had predicted. Still, Vance was methodical by nature, and he set about organizing the chaos with the same careful precision he applied to all his work. It was during this initial research that he first encountered mention of what would later be called the silent quarters. The reference appeared in a report filed in 1843 by a city health inspector named Thomas Gadsden. Gadsden had been investigating a fever outbreak on several plantations and noted, almost in passing, that certain slave quarters appeared unusually free of common vermin and disease-carrying pests. He attributed this oddity to superior construction, or perhaps to the particular composition of the soil, and pursued the matter no further. The observation was buried within a lengthy report packed with mortality statistics and recommendations for drainage improvements. Vance might have missed it entirely, had he not come across two additional references in reports from later years. Another inspector had recorded the same oddity at an entirely different plantation. Then a surveyor's report from 1846 stated that the slave quarters on the Milton estate showed no signs of rat infestation, unlike every other building on the property. Each time, the observation was treated as nothing more than an odd curiosity. No one followed up, no one asked why. But Vance's scientific training had conditioned him to notice patterns, to focus on anomalies that repeated themselves across time and place. And there was something about these recurring notes that unsettled him. In his experience, slave quarters were almost always overrun with vermin. They were hastily constructed, poorly maintained structures, riddled with gaps in walls and floors that offered easy entry for rats, snakes, and insects. The people forced to live inside them had neither the tools nor the authority to fight infestations. Food scraps and waste inevitably attracted pests. It was one of the quieter cruelties of the system. Human beings compelled to endure living conditions that many planners would have considered unacceptable even for animals. So how could multiple quarters, spread across different plantations, all be free of vermin? What could possibly account for such a consistent and unnatural pattern? Vance decided he needed to see these places for himself. That decision meant straying from his assigned duties, devoting time to something that had nothing to do with property lines or tax assessments. But his curiosity had been awakened, and he had never been skilled at ignoring questions that demanded answers. He began by requesting permission to visit the plantations mentioned in the reports. This quickly proved more difficult than he had expected. Plantation owners in the Charleston Low Country were deeply suspicious of outsiders, especially Northerners, and especially men who asked questions about the living conditions of enslaved people. Political tensions between North and South were already escalating in 1847. The Mexican-American War was underway, and debates over whether newly acquired territories would allow slavery were inflaming tempers on both sides. Abolition was a word that could abruptly end a conversation or start a violent one. Still, Vance carried official credentials as a city-appointed surveyor, and he carefully framed his request in professional terms. He explained that his work required him to survey the full extent of each property, including the areas where the quarters were located. Most owners granted permission, though rarely without restrictions. He would be accompanied by an overseer. He was not to speak with the enslaved people. He was to complete his work quickly and leave. The first plantation he visited was called Riverside, situated roughly 15 miles up the Ashley River from Charleston. It was a rice plantation, among the most profitable in the region, owned by a man named Nathaniel Drayton. The main house was an impressive structure of brick and stucco, framed by towering live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Beyond it stretched hundreds of acres of rice fields, divided by an intricate network of dikes and canals that allowed the land to be flooded and drained with careful precision. The slave quarters at Riverside stood about a quarter mile from the main house, a long row of small wooden buildings that housed nearly 200 people. Vance was escorted by the plantation's head overseer, a man named Cyrus Holt, who made no effort to conceal his disdain for the surveyor's interest in what he called the Negro houses. "They're just shacks," Holt said as they walked toward the quarters. "Built cheap, fall apart every few years. We throw up new ones. Nothing special about them." But as they drew closer, Vance instinctively slowed his pace. The quarters were crude, just as Holt had described. Single-room structures with palmetto thatched roofs and walls made of rough-hewn boards. Yet they were quiet in a way that felt wrong. There was no scratching inside the walls, no rustling beneath the floors. More striking still, there were no snakes coiled on the wooden steps to warm themselves, no rat droppings scattered in the dirt around the foundations. Vance asked if he could enter one of the quarters. Holt shrugged and unlocked the door to a building that was currently unoccupied, its residents working in the fields. Inside, the room was dim and bare. A few rough pallets lay on the floor. A small fireplace stood cold. Simple cooking implements rested against the wall. The air carried the scent of smoke, sweat, and old wood, but nothing else. There were no gnawed holes in the walls, no nests tucked into corners, no shed snake skins caught in the rafters. "You see," Holt said, "nothing here. Can we get on with the real work now?" Vance did not respond. He was running his hands along the interior walls, feeling the rough boards. That was when he noticed it. The gaps between the planks had been packed tightly with a gray clay, sealing every crack. Clay chinking was common enough, used to block drafts and keep out rain. But this clay was different. Its texture was unusual, slightly greasy to the touch, and it carried a faint odor he couldn't immediately place. Something mineral, something that reminded him, unexpectedly, of the sharp scent near a blacksmith's forge. Where did this clay come from? Vance asked. Holt stared at him as though he'd asked something absurd. "From the ground, I suppose. There's clay all over this land. The Negroes dig it up for chinking, for bricks, for whatever they need. But where exactly?" Vance pressed. "Which part of property?" Holt's expression hardened, shifting from contempt to irritation. "How the hell should I know? You have to ask them, and I'm not wasting my time translating questions about dirt." Vance made a brief note in his survey book. Then he asked if he might take a small sample of the clay. Holt shrugged again. He could see no reason a surveyor would be interested in such a thing. Carefully, Vance scraped a bit of material into a small glass vial he carried for soil specimens. Over the next 3 weeks, Vance visited 6 more plantations where reports had mentioned quarters free of vermin. Each time, he encountered the same conditions: buildings unnaturally silent and untouched by pests, their walls sealed with the same gray clay. It was always identical, the same slick texture, the same faint metallic scent. And every time he asked where it came from, he received the same vague response: somewhere on the property. The enslaved people knew where to find it. The overseers and owners had never concerned themselves with such details. But Vance was beginning to form a theory. The clay itself was keeping the vermin away. Something in its composition, a mineral, a chemical property, was acting as a natural repellent. From a scientific perspective, it was a fascinating discovery, but it also raised darker, more troubling questions. If the clay repelled rats and snakes, what effect might it have on human beings who live in constant contact with it? What consequences might come from breathing its dust, touching it daily, sleeping inches from it every night? Were there health effects no one had bothered to consider? Vance knew he needed to analyze the clay properly, using the chemical methods he had learned at university. But Charleston offered only limited scientific facilities, and he did not trust local authorities with his findings, not yet. Not until he fully understood what he was dealing with. So, he wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia, a chemist named Dr. Elias Vance, and sent him several samples of the clay along with a meticulous description of where it had been collected and under what conditions. Then he waited. Correspondence between Charleston and Philadelphia took at least a week each way, and Vance understood that a thorough chemical analysis would not be quick. In the meantime, he continued with his official surveying duties, measuring boundaries and reviewing deeds. But his thoughts continually returned to the silent quarters and the strained gray clay sealed into their walls. It was during this period of waiting that Vance first spoke with someone who had actually lived inside one of those houses. Her name was Ira, though everyone called her Ma, a title of respect that reflected both her age and the quiet authority she held within the enslaved community. She was perhaps 60 years old, though hardship had carved her face so deeply that she appeared older. Her hair was completely white, her back slightly bent, but her eyes were sharp, observant, and unsettlingly aware. She had been born into slavery on one of the Sea Island plantations and had spent her entire life in the low country. At the time, she was living on a plantation called Oakwood, where Vance had been sent to survey a disputed property line. He encountered her by chance, or perhaps by her intention. That day, the overseer had been called away to handle some urgent matter in the fields, leaving Vance to work alone near the quarters. As he took measurements, Ira approached him slowly, leaning on a worn walking stick. "You the man been asking about the quiet houses," she said. It was not phrased as a question. Vance was startled. He had been careful, deliberately neutral in his inquiries, doing his best not to reveal his true interest. Yet word had clearly traveled to the unseen network of communication that existed among the enslaved people, invisible to their owners, but remarkably effective. "I'm a surveyor," Vance replied cautiously. "I've noticed that some of the quarters seem free of vermin, and I was curious why." Ira studied him for a long moment, her gaze heavy and searching. Then she said, "You got the look of a man who wants to know things. But knowing things can be dangerous, especially for a white man asking questions about how we live." "I mean no harm," Vance said. "I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" she asked quietly. "Why the rats don't come? Why the snakes stay away?" She shook her head slowly. "Those houses are quiet because of the mud, the gray mud from a bad place. We've been using it for years because it keeps the vermin out. And Lord knows we got enough troubles without rats eating our food, snakes biting our children." "The bad place?" Vance asked. "What do you mean?" Ira glanced around, making sure they were truly alone. Then she lowered her voice to a whisper. "There's a swamp about 3 miles inland from here. The old people call it the Whispering Earth. The mud there is different. Gray, heavy, smells like metal. Animals won't go near it. Birds don't fly over it. Even the mosquitoes stay away. We learned long ago that if you pack that mud into the walls of a house, the vermin won't come in. So we use it." She paused, then continued, her voice steady but tired. "We walk 3 miles to dig it up, carry it back in buckets, pack it into every crack and gap, because a house without rats is a blessing, even if—" Her words trailed off. Vance saw something pass over her face that made his stomach tighten. Fear and something deeper, resignation. The look of someone who knows a terrible truth and has no power to escape it. "Even if what?" he asked gently. She was silent for a long time before answering. "Even if the people who live in those houses get sick, even if they grow weak and tired, even if their bones ache, their teeth fall out, if they waste away for no reason the doctors can name. We know the mud is bad for us. We've known it for years, but we use it anyway." She met his eyes. "The choice is slow sickness, or rats that spread fever, snakes that kill children, insects that make life unbearable. We choose the slow sickness." We don't have the luxury of choosing health. Something twisted painfully in Vance's chest. How long have people been using this mud? As long as I can remember, Ira said. My grandmother used it, her mother before her. Been that way since the first quarters went up on these plantations. Maybe longer. The white folks never noticed, never cared. Why would they? They don't live in those houses. They don't breathe that dust every day. They don't watch their children grow up weak and sick. Where exactly is the swamp? Vance asked. The Whispering Earth. She gave him directions, a complicated sequence of landmarks marked by old trees, abandoned rice fields, and narrow paths that didn't appear on any map. Then she asked, You gonna go there? Yes, Vance said without hesitation. I need to see it for myself. I need to understand what's in that mud. And then what? She asked. Say you figure it out. Say you learn the mud is poison, killing us slow for generations. What you gonna do with that knowledge? You think the masters will care? You think they'll tear down the quarters and build new ones with clean materials? Or just find another cheap way to make us suffer? Vance had no answer. He wanted to believe that knowledge led to change, that exposing the truth forced people to act. But he was not naive. He understood the power structures of the South, understood how little value was placed on enslaved lives. I don't know what will happen, he said at last, but I have to try. I have to document what I find. Maybe it won't change anything now, but someday the system will end. It has to end. And when it does, maybe this will matter. Maybe it will be part of the record, part of the accounting of what was done to your people. Ira looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. You a good man, I think, but good men don't change the world. Power changes the world, and you don't have any power here. She turned and walked away, leaning heavily on her stick, leaving Vance alone with his surveying equipment and a growing sense of dread. The Whispering Earth did not appear on any map Vance had ever seen. Using Ira's directions, he set out early one morning in late May, when the heat was already oppressive and the air thick with humidity. He told Mrs. Talbert that he would be gone for the day, conducting field work, surveys and packed water, some bread and cheese, his surveying instruments, and several glass vials for collecting additional samples. The route took him inland, away from the orderly geometry of the plantations, and into the untamed low country that lay between cultivated fields. This was a harsh landscape of dense maritime forest, tangled palmetto thickets, and sprawling swamps where the water was stained the color of dark tea by tannins leached from decaying vegetation. The paths were narrow and often submerged, and more than once Vance found himself wading through knee-deep water, his boots squelching loudly in the mud with every step. He had been walking for nearly 2 hours when he sensed a change. The forest around him had grown unnaturally quiet. The constant background chorus of birds and insects faded until it was nearly gone. Even the breeze seemed to die, leaving the air heavy and unmoving. And then there was a smell, faint at first, but growing stronger as he pressed on, the same metallic odor he had noticed in the clay samples, only sharper now, almost overwhelming. Then he saw it, the swamp Ira had called the Whispering Earth. It covered perhaps 2 acres, a shallow depression where water had pooled and stagnated. But the water was not the dark, tannin-stained brown typical of southern swamps. Instead, it was gray, almost milky, with an oily sheen drifting across its surface. The trees along its edges were dead or dying, their bark sloughing away to reveal pale, sickly wood beneath. At the water's edge, the ground was coated in the same gray clay, exposed where the water level had dropped during the dry season. Vance approached cautiously, every instinct warning him that this was a place of danger. There were no animals in sight, no birds perched in the trees, no turtles basked on fallen logs, no fish disturbed the surface of the water. The silence was complete, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the wet suction of his boots in the mud. He knelt at the edge of the swamp and examined the clay closely. It was identical to what he had seen in the quarters, the same greasy consistency, the same metallic scent. He carefully filled several vials with material, taking care to minimize contact with his skin. Then he opened a small notebook and began sketching the area, noting the dead trees, the strange coloration of the water, and the utter absence of life. As he worked, he became aware of a sound. It was faint, barely audible, a soft whispering hiss that seemed to rise from the swamp itself. He realized it was caused by gas bubbles drifting up to the water and bursting at the surface, releasing whatever compounds were trapped in the sediment below. It was a natural process, but in the oppressive silence of that place, it sounded unsettlingly like voices, as though the earth itself were murmuring in a language he could not comprehend. The Whispering Earth. Now he understood the name. He spent nearly an hour at the swamp, collecting samples and recording observations. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, he finally turned back toward Charleston. His thoughts raced the entire walk. What was embedded in that clay? What mineral or chemical gave it such strange properties? The ability to repel animals, the slick texture, the metallic odor. And most troubling of all, what did it do to the human body? Ira's words echoed in his mind. The people who live in those houses get sick. They get weak and tired. Their bones ache. Their teeth fall out. Those were symptoms of something specific. Some form of poisoning, some chronic exposure to a harmful substance. But which one? When Vance returned to his boarding house that evening, exhausted and streaked with mud, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from Dr. Elias Finch in Philadelphia, responding to the clay samples Vance had mailed weeks earlier. Vance tore open the envelope with trembling hands and began to read. "My dear Vance," the letter began, "I have completed my analysis of the clay samples you sent, and I must confess that the results are both fascinating and deeply troubling. The material contains extraordinarily high concentrations of several heavy metals, most notably lead, arsenic, and mercury. The lead content alone is sufficient to explain the absence of vermin. Rats and snakes are highly sensitive to lead poisoning and will instinctively avoid environments where it is present. However, I must emphasize that these same properties make the clay extremely dangerous to human health. Chronic exposure to lead produces a constellation of symptoms, including fatigue, weakness, abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, and in severe cases, death. Arsenic and mercury cause similar damage. If people are living in structures where this clay has been used extensively, they are, quite literally, being poisoned slowly over the course of years or decades. The source of these metals is almost certainly geological. There must be a mineral deposit in the area where the clay is found that is leaching these compounds into surrounding soil and water. Such deposits are not uncommon in coastal regions, but they are typically avoided for habitation precisely because of their toxic nature. I urge you to bring this matter to the attention of the appropriate authorities immediately. If what you described is accurate, that this clay has been used in housing for enslaved people across multiple plantations, then this constitutes a public health crisis of considerable magnitude. Please write to me with any further developments. I remain your colleague and friend, Dr. Alistair Finch." Vance read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. He had suspected the clay was dangerous, but the truth was far worse than he had imagined. Lead, arsenic, mercury, these were poisons in their purest form, and people had been living alongside them, breathing their dust, touching their walls for generations. He thought of children growing up in those quarters, their developing minds and bodies exposed to neurotoxins from their very first breath. He thought of men and women who had no choice but to live in those structures, who had chosen the slow death of poisoning over the immediate dangers posed by vermin. He remembered Ira's words. "We don't have the luxury of choosing health," and he knew he could not remain silent. He had to document what he had found. He had to bring it into the light. He had to force someone, somewhere, to acknowledge what was happening. But who would listen? Who would care? The following morning, Vance went to the Charleston city offices carrying Dr. Finch's letter and his own meticulous notes. He requested a meeting with the city health officer, a man named Dr. Samuel Priolo, who was responsible for monitoring disease outbreaks and sanitary conditions throughout the city and the surrounding countryside. Dr. Priolo was a Charleston native, a man in his 50s with the polished manners and refined accent of the local aristocracy. He received Vance in his office, a space lined with medical texts and anatomical charts, and listened with outward politeness as the surveyor laid out his findings in careful detail. When Vance finished, Dr. Priolo remained silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your diligence in bringing this matter to my attention. However, I must point out several problems with your conclusions." "Problems?" Vance replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Dr. Finch's analysis is unequivocal. The clay contains dangerous concentrations of heavy metals. People are being poisoned. Dr. Finch is no doubt a respected chemist," Priolo said smoothly, "but he conducted his analysis in a laboratory in Philadelphia, far removed from the actual conditions here. He does not understand the constitution of the Negro, which is fundamentally different from that of the white man. What may be harmful to us may have little effect on them. They are adapted to this climate, to these conditions, in ways we are not." Vance stared at him in disbelief. "That isn't how chemistry works. Lead is lead. It doesn't change based on race." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Priolo replied, his tone cooling noticeably. "There is extensive medical literature describing the differences between the races. The Negro has thicker skin, a different composition of blood, a greater tolerance for heat and disease. These are established scientific facts." "They're not facts," Vance shot back, his voice rising despite himself. "They're justifications, excuses for treating people as less than human." Priolo's expression hardened. "Mr. Vance, I understand that you come from Philadelphia, where certain progressive notions are fashionable, but you are in Charleston now. You would do well to remember that the institution of slavery is the foundation of our economy and our society. It is protected by law and by custom. I will not allow unfounded accusations about the health conditions of slave quarters to be used as ammunition by abolitionists and other troublemakers." "These aren't unfounded accusations," Vance said. "I have chemical analysis. I have physical samples. I have testimony from people who have lived in those quarters and watched their families grow sick and die." "Testimony from slaves," Priolo replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "People who would say anything to cause trouble for their masters. That is your evidence." In that moment, Vance understood he was getting nowhere. Priolo had no interest in the truth. He was part of the system that benefited from it, and he would defend that system against any challenge, no matter how thoroughly documented. "I see," Vance said quietly. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Priolo." He left the office feeling a volatile mixture of rage and despair. He had been naive to believe that facts alone would be enough. The people in power did not want to know the truth. They wanted the status quo preserved, their wealth and way of life protected, regardless of the human cost. But Vance was not ready to surrender. If the local authorities refused to act, he would pursue other paths. He wrote to abolitionist newspapers in the North, detailing his findings as carefully as he could. He wrote to medical journals, hoping Dr. Finch's analysis might be published and debated in professional circles. He wrote to members of Congress known to oppose slavery, supplying documentation that could be used in speeches and legislative arguments. And he continued his investigation. If he was going to expose this injustice, and he had come to see it as a crime, a slow and deliberate poisoning of innocent people, he needed more than chemical data. He needed to show the human cost, to make clear what this poisoning looked like in real lives. He began returning to plantations, this time seeking out the enslaved people themselves. He spoke with them when overseers were distracted or absent, asking about their health, their families, their experiences living in the quarters. It was dangerous work. If he were discovered, he could be driven off the property or worse. But a sense of moral urgency pushed him forward, overpowering his caution. What he learned was devastating. Story after story of children who had died young, of adults who had lost their strength and vitality in their 30s, of mysterious illnesses at plantation doctors could neither explain nor treat. People spoke of chronic pain, weakness in their limbs, confusion and memory loss that crept in over time. They told him of miscarriages and stillbirths, of children born with deformities or developmental delays. And in every account, the same pattern emerged. The worst symptoms appeared in those who had spent their entire lives in quarters sealed with gray clay, those who had been moved to different housing or who had spent extended periods away from plantations, often showed some degree of improvement. It was a clear dose-response relationship, exactly what one would expect from long-term exposure to toxic substances. Vance documented everything with painstaking care. He created charts showing the correlation between years spent in contaminated quarters and the severity of symptoms. He recorded testimonies, though cautiously. He could not use real names. He could not identify specific plantations. To do so would put his informants at risk of punishment or retaliation. As the summer of 1847 gave way to autumn, Vance became increasingly consumed by his work. His official surveying duties were neglected. His days were spent chasing leads, his nights writing and revising his findings. Mrs. Talbert began to worry about him. He was losing weight, sleeping poorly, growing withdrawn and obsessive, and he was being watched. At first, he did not realize it, but the plantation owners had taken notice. A northern surveyor who spent too much time talking to slaves, who asked too many questions about their living conditions, who seemed to have motives extending well beyond his professional responsibilities. It was suspicious, potentially dangerous. In October, Vance received a visit from a man named Richard Wentworth, who introduced himself as a representative of the Charleston Planters Association. Wentworth was in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. Vance," he said, settling into a chair in the parlor of the boarding house, "I understand you've been conducting some sort of investigation into the slave quarters on several plantations." "I'm a surveyor," Vance replied carefully. "I'm conducting the survey I was contracted to do." "Come now," Wentworth said with a thin, knowing smile. "Let's not play games. We know you've been asking questions about health conditions, collecting samples of building materials, corresponding with abolitionists in the North. We know you've been speaking with slaves without the permission of their owners. These are serious matters, Mr. Vance." "I've uncovered a serious public health issue," Vance replied. "The clay being used to build the slave quarters contains dangerous levels of heavy metals. People are being poisoned." "So I've heard," Wentworth said calmly, "and I'm here to inform you that your investigation is over. You will cease all inquiries into this matter. You will destroy any documents you created, and you will leave Charleston within the week." "I will do no such thing," Vance said, his voice trembling with anger. "What's happening here is a crime. People are dying because of negligence and greed. People are dying because they are slaves," Wentworth said flatly. "They are property, Mr. Vance. They have no rights, no legal standing, and you, as a visitor to the city, have no authority to interfere in how property is managed. They're human beings," Vance said. "That is a matter of opinion," Wentworth replied, "and it is not an opinion shared by the laws of South Carolina or of the United States." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been polite, Mr. Vance, because I believe you are simply misguided, influenced by the radical ideas that are fashionable in Philadelphia. But my patience has limits. If you continue this investigation, if you publish your findings or share them with abolitionist agitators, there will be consequences. Your surveying contract will be terminated. Your reputation will be destroyed, and you may discover that Charleston is not a safe place for you." It was a threat barely concealed. Vance felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to meet Wentworth's gaze. "I'm not afraid of you." "Then you're a fool," Wentworth said. He rose, straightening his coat. "You have 1 week, Mr. Vance. I suggest you use it wisely." After Wentworth left, Vance sat alone in the parlor, his thoughts racing. He was in danger. That much was undeniable. But he could not simply abandon his investigation. He could not let this crime remain hidden. He thought of all the people who had trusted him with their stories, of the children growing up in those poisoned quarters. He owed them something. He owed them the truth. Yet he also had to be realistic. If he remained in Charleston, he would likely be silenced one way or another. His papers could be seized or destroyed. He might be arrested on some fabricated charge, or simply vanish one night, another casualty of the violence lurking beneath Southern gentility. His findings had to leave Charleston, had to reach a place where they could be protected, published, and debated. And it had to happen quickly, before Wentworth's deadline expired. For the next 3 days, Vance worked feverishly. He made multiple copies of everything: his notes, maps, chemical analyses charts, and recorded testimonies. He bundled them into separate parcels, addressing each to a different recipient. Dr. Finch in Philadelphia, an abolitionist newspaper editor in Boston, a congressman in Washington. He mailed them from different post offices and shipping companies, dispersing the risk so that if one package was intercepted, others might still reach their destination. On the 6th day after Wentworth's visit, Vance left Charleston. He told Mrs. Talbert that he was traveling to Savannah to consult with colleagues. He took only a small bag, leaving most of his belongings behind, and boarded a northbound train. As the city receded from view, he felt a mix of relief and regret. He had failed to change anything in Charleston. The quarters would continue to poison their inhabitants. The plantation owners would continue to profit. The authorities would continue to look away. But he had documented the truth, and he believed that someday the truth would matter. Vance returned to Philadelphia in November of 1847, physically and emotionally exhausted. He had lost nearly 20 pounds during his time in Charleston and was plagued by nightmares that jolted him awake, gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat. In his dreams, he wandered through endless rows of silent quarters, their walls oozing gray clay while ghostly figures watched him with accusing eyes. Dr. Finch was stunned by his friend's appearance. "My God, Elias," he said when they met at a coffee house near the university. "What happened to you down there?" Vance told him everything: the investigation, the discoveries, the denials, the threats, and his hurried escape. Finch listened in mounting horror. "We have to publish this," Finch said when Vance finished. "We have to get this information to the public." "I've tried," Vance replied wearily. "I sent my findings to newspapers, to medical journals, to politicians. Most never responded. Those who did weren't interested. The northern papers say it's too inflammatory, that it will be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. The medical journals say they need more rigorous evidence, that testimony from slaves isn't reliable data. The politicians say they can't act without official reports from local authorities. And we both know those authorities will never acknowledge the problem. So what do we do?" Finch asked. "I don't know," Vance admitted. "I feel like I'm shouting into a void. I have the truth. I have the evidence. But no one wants to hear it." Finch, however, refused to surrender. As a member of the American Philosophical Society, one of the nation's oldest and most respected scientific institutions, he proposed that Vance present his findings at one of the society's meetings. The work would be framed as a case study in environmental toxicology, not as a political indictment of slavery. Vance agreed, though he remained doubtful about the outcome. Over the next several weeks, he prepared a formal presentation, complete with chemical analyses, maps, charts, and statistical correlations. He deliberately minimized the human stories, focusing instead on the science: the composition of the clay, the mechanisms by which heavy metals leach into living spaces, and the clear dose, response pattern consistent with chronic poisoning. The presentation took place on a bitterly cold evening in January of 1848. The audience numbered around 30 professors, physicians, chemists, and other members of society, seated in attentive silence as Vance stepped forward to speak. Within the scientific community, Vance spoke for nearly an hour, his voice steady despite his nerves, presenting his findings with the same careful precision he had once applied to his surveying work. When he finished, the room fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. Then the questions began. "How can you be certain," one physician asked, "that the symptoms you describe are caused by the clay and not by other factors? Enslaved people live under conditions of extreme hardship. They suffer from malnutrition, overwork, and constant exposure to disease. Any one of these could explain the illnesses you observed." "I accounted for those factors," Vance replied. "I compared health outcomes between people living in quarters constructed with a contaminated clay and those living in quarters without it, controlling for other variables as much as possible. The correlation is clear and consistent. But your sample size is small," another scientist objected, "and your data collection methods were, shall we say, informal. You relied heavily on anecdotal reports rather than systematic medical examinations." "I worked with the resources available to me," Vance said, struggling to keep the frustration from his voice. "I couldn't exactly conduct controlled experiments on human subjects, but the chemical analysis is solid. Dr. Finch can attest to that. The clay contains dangerous concentrations of lead, arsenic, and mercury. That isn't anecdotal. That is measurable, reproducible fact. No one here disputes the chemical analysis," a third man said. This was Dr. Samuel Morton, a prominent physician and anthropologist. "But you are making a logical leap not supported by the evidence. You assume that what is toxic to white Europeans must be equally toxic to Africans. There is substantial evidence that different races exhibit different physiological responses to environmental factors. The Negro Constitution may be more resistant to these substances than our own." Vance felt his temper flare. "That is pseudo-scientific nonsense," he said sharply. "Lead poisoning does not discriminate by race. The mechanism is the same regardless of skin color." "I'm afraid," Dr. Morton replied coldly, "that you are allowing your political sympathies to cloud your scientific judgment. This presentation has been less about toxicology and more about abolitionist propaganda." From there, the meeting dissolved into open argument. Some members defended Vance's work, praising his methodology given constraints under which he had operated. Others attacked it as speculative, biased, and politically motivated. When the debate finally ended, the society declined to publish its findings in its proceedings, citing insufficient scientific rigor and the presence of political bias. Vance left the meeting feeling hollow and defeated. Even among men who prided themselves on reason and evidence, the truth was being rejected because it was inconvenient, because it threatened deeply entrenched beliefs about race and slavery that underpin American society. Yet one person in the audience had listened carefully and believed. Her name was Catherine Hartwell. She was a 26-year-old daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who had made his fortune in shipping. Unmarried by choice, she was deeply involved in the abolitionist movement and had attended the presentation, hoping to find new evidence against slavery. Vance's account had riveted her. She approached him afterward and asked if they might speak privately. The following day, they met at her family's townhouse on Rittenhouse Square, a grand but understated building that reflected both wealth and restraint. "Mr. Vance," she said once they were seated in the parlor, "I believe your findings are important, and I want to help you see them published. But I think you've been going about this the wrong way." "What do you mean?" Vance asked. "You've been trying to present this as a purely scientific matter," Catherine said. "But it isn't. It's a moral matter, a political one. The reason people are rejecting your work isn't because the science is flawed. It's because accepting your conclusions would force them to admit that slavery is even more monstrous than they already know it to be. And most people, even those who consider themselves enlightened, are not ready to face that. So what do you suggest?" Vance asked. "Stop trying to convince scientists and politicians," she said. "Go directly to the public. Tell your story in a way that makes people feel the horror of what you discovered. Make them see the human cost, not just the chemical formulas." "I've tried," Vance said. "The newspapers won't publish it." "The mainstream newspapers won't," Catherine agreed. "But abolitionist publications will. And there are lecture circuits, speaking tours. People will pay to hear first-hand accounts of the realities of slavery." Vance hesitated. He was not a natural public speaker, and the idea of turning his investigation into something resembling a performance made him uncomfortable. But Catherine was persuasive, and he was desperate to make his work matter in some tangible way. Over the next several months, with Catherine's help and connections, Vance began speaking at abolitionist meetings, churches, and halls throughout Pennsylvania and New York. He told the story of the silent quarters of the gray clay, and of the slow poisoning of people who had no choice but to live inside those toxic walls. He displayed his maps and chemical analyses and read carefully selected excerpts from the testimonies he had collected, always protecting the identities of those who had trusted him. The response was intense. Audiences were horrified and outraged. Some people wept openly as Vance described children growing up in poisoned homes, their bodies and minds damaged by toxins they could neither see nor understand. Others shouted demands for justice, for action, for an end to the system that allowed such cruelty to exist. But there was hostility as well. At several events, pro-slavery agitators disrupted his lectures, shouting accusations or threatening violence. He received anonymous letters calling him a liar, a traitor, a race mixer. One night, someone hurled a brick through the window of his lodgings. Attached to it was a note that read, "Go back to Charleston and we'll give you a proper Southern welcome." Despite the danger, Vance continued his speaking tour throughout 1848 and into 1849. He became a minor celebrity in abolitionist circles, his work cited as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. Frederick Douglass mentioned him in a speech. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote to him, asking for details about the poisoned quarters and the gray clay, details she said she wished to remember. For the first time since leaving Charleston, Vance felt that the truth he had uncovered was no longer trapped in silence. A letter expressing her admiration for his courage, but Vance took no pleasure in the attention. He was haunted by the knowledge that his work had changed nothing for the people still living in those quarters. The plantations continued to operate. The gray clay continued to poison. And he was hundreds of miles away, telling stories to audiences who could afford to be horrified precisely because they were safely removed from reality. In the summer of 1849, Vance received a letter that would change everything. It was from a man named Jacob Hemlock, who identified himself as a free black man living in Charleston. Hemlock wrote that he had learned of Vance's work through the Abolitionist network and that he possessed information Vance needed to hear. The letter was careful, almost cryptic, but it hinted at something far more disturbing than Vance had yet uncovered. New evidence about the source of the contaminated clay, about who knew what and when, and about decisions that had been made deliberately rather than out of ignorance. Hemlock could not put the details in writing, he said. It was too dangerous. But if Vance were willing to return to Charleston, Hemlock would tell him everything. Vance showed the letter to Catherine immediately. "It could be a trap," she said without hesitation. "You know there are people in Charleston who would gladly see you silenced." "I know," Vance replied. "But what if it's real? What if there's more to this than I ever uncovered? I can't ignore that possibility." "Then don't go alone," Catherine said. "Take precautions. Make sure someone knows where you are and what you're doing." In the end, Vance decided to return to Charleston, but carefully. He arranged for regular letters to be sent to Catherine and to Dr. Finch, so that if they stopped arriving, his disappearance would be noticed. He traveled under an assumed name. He carried a pistol, though he had never fired one in his life, and doubted he would have the nerve to use it if the moment came. He arrived in Charleston in August of 1849, nearly 2 years after fleeing the city. It was the height of summer. The heat was suffocating, the air so thick with humidity that it felt like breathing water. He took a room at a small boarding house in a different part of the city, far from where he had stayed before, and sent word to Jacob Hemlock through the address provided in the letter. 2 days later, Hemlock came to meet him. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the guarded, deliberate manner of someone who had learned to survive in a world that was constantly hostile. Free black people in Charleston lived in precarious state, possessing limited legal rights, yet always under suspicion, always vulnerable to harassment or worse. They met in Vance's room, the door locked, the curtains drawn. Hemlock wasted no time. "What you found about the clay is true," he said. But it's worse than you know. This wasn't ignorance, Mr. Vance. It was deliberate. Vance felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean? I mean the plantation owners knew, Hemlock said. They knew the clay was poisonous. They knew it made people sick. And they used it anyway, because it was cheap, because it kept vermin away, and because they did not care what happened to people living in those quarters. How do you know this? Vance asked. Because I used to work for one of them, Hemlock said. Before I bought my freedom, I was a house servant to Nathaniel Drayton. Vance nodded. Riverside Plantation, the very first place he had investigated. Drayton kept records, Hemlock continued. Detailed records, crop yields, expenses, slave purchases, medical costs. And in those records were notes about the quarters, how using the gray clay from the Whispering Earth reduced construction costs and eliminated the need for pest control. There were also notes about higher rates of sickness and death among the slaves who lived in those quarters. But that was considered acceptable because the savings more than offset the cost of replacing them. Vance felt nauseated. He calculated it, he said quietly. He weighed the cost of human lives against building materials. That's exactly what he did, Hemlock replied. And he wasn't alone. The plantation owners discussed it among themselves. They shared information, where to find the clay, how best to use it. It was a business decision. Cold, rational, human beings reduced to assets. Where are these records? Vance asked. Can we get them? Hemlock shook his head. Drayton keeps them in a safe in his study. I no longer have access, but I know they exist. I know what they say because I saw them. I was taught to read and write. His wife insisted on it, said it made me more useful. I helped copy documents. That's how I saw the notes. Would you testify? Vance asked. Make a sworn statement? Hemlock let out a short, bitter laugh. Who would believe a black man over a white plantation owner? Even if I could testify, and I'm not certain I legally can, it would be my word against his. And we both know which one would matter. But if we had the records themselves, Vance said, his thoughts racing, if we had documentary proof, something undeniable. You're talking about breaking into Drayton's house, Hemlock said flatly. You're talking about theft, a serious crime. You'd be risking prison or worse. I know, Vance said, but those records could prove this was not negligence. It was deliberate poisoning. That could change everything. Or it could get you killed, Hemlock said. And me as well. They sat in silence for a long moment. I'm going to do it, Vance finally said. I have to, but I won't ask you to be involved. You've already risked enough. Hemlock studied him carefully, then shook his head. You're a fool, Mr. Vance, he said. But you're a brave fool. He sighed. All right, I'll help you. But we do this my way, and we do it carefully. Over the next week, Hemlock and Vance planned to break in with meticulous care. Startled by the sudden noise, Vance barely had time to register what was happening when the door at the top of the stairs burst open and armed men poured into the cellar. It happened in an instant. They moved with military precision, seizing Wentworth and his companion, forcing them to ground and securing their hands behind their backs. Vance stood frozen, trying to process the chaos, when he recognized a familiar face, Jacob Hemlock, and behind him, two other men, unfamiliar but moving with the same resolute determination. Hemlock quickly approached and began untying Vance's hands with a small knife. There wasn't time to wait, he said quietly, focused. They knew you might return. I gathered backup in case something went wrong. Vance still clutched his wrist, shock coursing through him. I thought it was over. Not yet, while we're here, Hemlock said sternly. Now move fast. They ascended the stairs, keeping low, moving through the shadows of the empty house. Vance could see the gas lamps outside flickering dimly through the windows, casting long, dancing shadows along the walls. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and adrenaline mingling into a sharp, dizzying edge. The two men with Hemlock positioned themselves at intervals, scanning the hallways and doors for any sign of pursuit. Once outside, the humid night air hit them like a wall, heavy and suffocating, but free. Vance followed Hemlock and the others through back alleys and side streets, carefully avoiding main roads and lit areas. Every step was tense, every shadow a potential threat. He kept his hand on the coat pocket where the copied ledger pages were hidden, realizing that, against all odds, the most dangerous part of the night had passed. They had the evidence. They paused in a narrow alley behind a row of warehouses to catch their breath. Hemlock turned to Vance, his face grim in the lamplight. "You're a marked man now. Wentworth and Drayton will know someone took those papers. They'll search, interrogate, and punish anyone they suspect. You leave tonight, go north, and don't look back." Vance nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "And you?" "I'll blend back into the city," Hemlock said. "I know how to disappear. But you need to move. Train leaves at first light. Don't miss it." As dawn approached, Vance made his way to the train station under the cover of early morning shadows, his small bag clutched tightly. Every step echoed in his mind. The silent quarters, the gray clay, the children and adults poisoned for profit. The documents he carried were more than just papers. They were the proof of calculated cruelty, a cold, deliberate indifference to human life. The train ride north was long and tense. Vance could not rest. He kept thinking of Hemlock, of Catherine Hartwell, of Dr. Finch, and of all the people who had helped him. He worried about whether the copied pages would make it safely into hands of those who could act on them. Each passing mile carried him further from Charleston. Yet the way to the city, the knowledge of what he'd seen, never left him. Upon arrival in Philadelphia, Vance immediately sought out Dr. Finch and Catherine. The reunion was tense but relieved. Finch examined the copies of the ledger with growing horror, his hands trembling. Catherine, ever practical and fiercely intelligent, began outlining a plan to disseminate the information safely and widely. "We need to make the public understand," she said. "Not just the facts, not just the numbers. The human cost. That's what will compel action." For the next several weeks, Vance, Finch, and Catherine worked tirelessly. They wrote articles, prepared public lectures, and arranged for the ledger copies to be shared with trusted abolitionist networks in Boston, New York, and beyond. Every correspondence was carefully encoded or sent through multiple channels to reduce the risk of interception. The story of the poisoned quarters, the gray clay, and the calculated indifference of the plantation owners began to spread. The reaction was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Some newspapers refused to publish, fearing backlash from Southern interests. Others were eager to expose the atrocity. Abolitionist societies invited Vance to speak, and he recounted, with measured precision, the scientific analyses, the testimony he collected, and the evidence from Drayton's ledger. Audiences were horrified and letters poured in, some praising his courage, others threatening violence. Vance understood that he had placed himself in danger again, but this time he was in the North, among allies, and the evidence was undeniable. Despite this progress, Vance never forgot the children in the quarters, the adults whose lives had been shortened by deliberate poisoning. The fight was far from over. He knew that public outrage alone might not be enough to dismantle the system that allowed such cruelty, but it was a start. And with the ledger safely copied and shared, he finally had the proof that the poisoning was intentional, that the suffering had been calculated and exploited for profit. It was a dark revelation, but one that he believed could not be ignored. Men, one of whom carried a lantern, moved swiftly toward Vance. "Mr. Vance," Hemlock said, kneeling beside him and cutting the ropes that bound his hands and feet. "Are you all right? How did you—" Vance started to speak, but Hemlock cut him off sharply. "No time for explanations. We need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" Vance nodded, though his legs were weak and shaky. Hemlock helped him to his feet, and together they climbed the stairs, emerging into what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The men who had rescued him were a mix of free blacks and white abolitionists, all armed and all looking grim and resolute. "We've been watching Wentworth," Hemlock explained as they hurried through the dark streets. "We knew he was searching for you, knew he had men combing the city. When they grabbed you, we followed at a distance. We couldn't intervene immediately. There were too many of them. We had to wait for reinforcements. But we got here in time." Vance's eyes darted to his coat pocket. "The papers?" he asked anxiously. "Wentworth has the papers." Hemlock patted the pocket reassuringly. "Everything you copied is safe." They moved quickly through the dark, narrow streets to the docks, where a small rowboat waited in the shadows. "This will take you to a ship leaving for Philadelphia tonight," Hemlock said. "You'll be safe once you're on board." Vance hesitated. "What about you?" he asked. "What about Wentworth?" Hemlock's face was set in determination. "Let him try. We have friends in this city more than you know, and we're tired of being silent. We're tired of watching people suffer and die, while men like Wentworth and Drayton profit from their misery. Your investigation, your courage, it's inspired people. It's shown us that truth matters, that it's worth fighting for." "But the risk," Vance began. "We've been living with risk our whole lives," Hemlock interrupted. "This is just another kind. Now go, get those papers to Philadelphia. Publish them. Tell the world what you found. Make sure what happened here is never forgotten." There was no time for farewells. Vance climbed into the boat, and the oars cut silently through the dark water. As the city receded behind him, he gazed at the lights of Charleston, the grand houses, and the church steeples silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere in that city, people were still living in quarters built with poison clay, their bodies slowly breaking down, their lives measured against economic calculations. Somewhere, men like Wentworth and Drayton slept peacefully, secure in their wealth and power, confident they would never face consequences. But Vance had the evidence now. He had the proof, and he would make sure the world knew. Vance arrived in Philadelphia in early September 1849, physically and emotionally exhausted but triumphant. He immediately contacted Dr. Finch and Catherine Hartwell, showing them the copied pages from Drayton's ledger. Their reactions mirrored his own horror and outrage. "This is it," Catherine said, her eyes blazing as she read the entries. "This is the evidence we needed. This proves that the poisoning was deliberate, that it was part of a calculated business strategy. This changes everything." Over the next several weeks, they worked tirelessly to get the documents published. It was not easy. Many newspapers were still reluctant to run such inflammatory material, fearing backlash from Southern interests or accusations of abolitionist bias. But finally, in October 1849, the New York Tribune published a lengthy article detailing Vance's investigation, including excerpts from Drayton's ledger. The response was explosive. The article was reprinted across the North, sparking outrage and calls for action. Abolitionist groups seized on it as proof of slavery's inherent evil. Some Northern politicians demanded federal investigations into conditions on Southern plantations. Even in the South, a few religious leaders and reform-minded individuals expressed shock and called for improvements in the treatment of enslaved people. Yet fierce resistance persisted. Southern newspapers denounced the article as a fabrication, claiming it was abolitionist propaganda designed to inflame tensions. They questioned the authenticity of the documents, suggesting Vance had forged them or taken them out of context. Some went further, attacking Vance personally, calling him a thief, a liar, and a traitor to his race. Nathaniel Drayton himself issued a statement denying all accusations. He claimed the ledger entries were misinterpreted, that he had never knowingly used toxic materials, and that the health problems were due to the supposed weakness of the Negro Constitution rather than environmental factors. He threatened to sue Vance and the Tribune for libel. The legal threats came to nothing. Drayton had no intention of actually going to court, where the documents could be examined and he might be forced to testify under oath. But the controversy raged for months, becoming part of the larger national debate over slavery that was tearing the country apart. Vance continued his speaking tours, now armed with even more powerful evidence. He showed audiences the copied pages from Drayton's ledger, allowing them to see the cold, calculated entries that reduce human life to profit and loss. The impact was profound. Many people who had been ambivalent about slavery or had accepted it as a necessary evil were forced to confront the reality of the system in practice. Yet Vance took no satisfaction in his growing fame. He was haunted by the knowledge that his investigation had changed nothing for those still living in the poisoned quarters. The plantations continued to operate. The clay continued to be used. Despite all the outrage and publicity, no one in authority had taken action to stop it. In the spring of 1850, Vance received a letter from Charleston. It was from Jacob Hemlock, and the news was grim. Wentworth and his associates had retaliated against the people who had helped rescue Vance. Several free blacks had been arrested on trumped-up charges. Others had been forced to flee the city. Rumors swirled that Hemlock himself, despite his skill and caution, was now being hunted. Himself was being watched, that he was in danger. "I don't regret what we did," Hemlock wrote, "but I wanted you to know the cost. I wanted you to understand that your investigation, your truth-telling, has consequences for people beyond yourself. We pay the price for your courage, Mr. Vance. We always have. That's the reality of the system." The letter shook Vance deeply. He had known intellectually that his work put others at risk, but seeing it spelled out so starkly, knowing that people were suffering because they had helped him, was almost unbearable. He wrote back immediately, offering to help in any way he could: money, legal assistance, connections to abolitionist networks that might get people to safety. But he never received a response. He didn't know if Hemlock had gotten the letter or if something had happened to him before it arrived. Over the following years, Vance continued his work, but the joy had gone out of it. He spoke at rallies, wrote articles, and corresponded with other abolitionists, but he was increasingly consumed by guilt and frustration. The country was sliding towards civil war. The tensions between North and South were becoming unbridgeable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that all his efforts had accomplished nothing. In 1852, he received a letter from Dr. Finch with news that brought him a small measure of comfort. A medical journal had finally published a paper on the health effects of heavy metal exposure, citing Vance's work and Finch's chemical analyses. It was a dry, technical piece focused on the science rather than politics, but it represented a kind of validation. The truth was entering the scientific record, becoming part of the body of knowledge that future generations would inherit. Then, in 1853, something unexpected happened. A plantation owner in Virginia, a man named Thomas Whitfield, known for his relatively progressive views on slavery, read about Vance's investigation and decided to have the quarters on his own plantation tested. He hired a chemist to analyze the materials used in construction, and the chemist found elevated levels of lead in the clay that had been used for chinking. Whitfield was horrified. He immediately ordered the quarters to be rebuilt using clean materials and wrote a letter to the Richmond Inquirer, describing what he found and urging other plantation owners to do the same. The letter caused a minor sensation in Virginia, and a few other owners followed Whitfield's example. It was a small victory, affecting only a handful of plantations out of thousands. But it was something. It was proof that the truth could make a difference. That knowledge could lead to change even in a system as entrenched and brutal as slavery. Vance lived to see the Civil War, though he was too old to fight. He spent the war years working with the United States Sanitary Commission, helping to improve conditions in military hospitals and camps. He often thought of the quarters he had investigated, of the people who had lived and died in those poisoned structures, wondering if any had survived to see freedom. After the war, during Reconstruction, Vance returned to Charleston one final time. He was 60 years old, his hair completely white, his body weakened by years of hard work and stress. The city had changed, occupied by federal troops, its economy shattered, its social order upended. Many of the grand houses were damaged or abandoned. The plantations that had once made the region wealthy struggled to adapt to a world without slave labor. Vance visited some of the plantations he had surveyed in 1847. The quarters were still standing, though many were empty now. The people who had lived in them were scattered by war, emancipation, or displacement. He walked through the silent structures, touching the walls still packed with gray clay, thinking of all the lives damaged or destroyed by the greed and callousness of men like Nathaniel Drayton. He tried to find some of the people he had spoken with during his investigation. Jacob Hemlock, the children, others whose stories had shaped his understanding. But most were gone, dead, moved away, or impossible to trace amid the chaos of the post-war South. He did find one person, however, a woman named Sarah, who had been a child living in one of the contaminated quarters when Vance first came to Charleston. She was now in her 30s, living in a small house in the city, working as a seamstress. She remembered him, or rather, she remembered the stories about the northern surveyor who had asked questions about the quarters, who had tried to expose the truth. Did it help, she asked. All your work, all your investigating, did it change anything? Vance wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that his work had mattered, that it had saved lives, that it had brought justice. But he couldn't lie to her. I don't know, he said honestly. Some people listened. Some things changed, but not enough, not nearly enough. Sarah nodded as if she had expected that answer. My mother died when I was 12, she said. She got sick the way so many did in those quarters. She wasted away, got weaker and weaker, until one day she didn't wake up. I always wondered why. Why her? Why so many others? And then I heard about your investigation, about the poison in the walls, and I understood. I'm sorry, Vance said. I'm so sorry I couldn't do more. You did what you could, Sarah said. You told the truth. That matters, even if it didn't change everything, because now we know. Now it's part of the record. And maybe someday, when people look back at this time, they'll understand what was done to us. They'll understand the full cost of slavery, not just the whips and chains, but the slow poisoning, the deliberate cruelty, the way our lives were calculated in dollars and cents. Vance left Charleston for the last time in the fall of 1865, carrying Sarah's words and the weight of all the stories he had collected over the years. He returned to Philadelphia and spent his remaining years writing a comprehensive account of his investigation, documenting everything he had learned about the silent quarters, the gray clay, and the men who had knowingly poisoned the people under their power. The manuscript was published in 1871, 2 years before Vance's death. It was not a bestseller. By then, the country was weary of hearing about the horrors of slavery, eager to move on and rebuild, but found an audience among historians and scholars who would preserve the record of what had happened and who would ensure that Vance's work would not be forgotten. Reformers, people who believed that the past needed to be remembered and understood, not forgotten. And in the decade that followed, as scholars began to seriously study the history of slavery and its effects, Vance's work became an important source. His meticulous documentation, his chemical analyses, his testimonies, all of it contributed to a growing understanding of the full scope of the system's cruelty. The silent quarters themselves gradually disappeared. Some were torn down during Reconstruction. Others simply collapsed from neglect, their poison walls crumbling back into the earth. The whispering earth, the swamp where the gray clay had been harvested, was eventually drained and filled in, its toxic sediments buried under layers of clean soil. But the story survived. It survived in Vance's writings, in the records he had so carefully preserved, in the memories of the people who had lived through it. And it served as a reminder, a dark, troubling reminder of what human beings are capable of when they value profit over life, when they see other people not as fellow humans, but as resources to be exploited and discarded. The mystery of the silent quarters, of the buildings where no rats or snakes would enter, had been solved. The answer was not supernatural, not mysterious in any mystical sense. It was brutally, terribly simple. The quarters were poisoned, deliberately poisoned, by men who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway because it saved them money. That was the truth that Elias Vance had uncovered. That was the truth he had spent years of his life documenting and fighting to expose. And that was a truth that even now, more than a century and a half later, still has the power to shock and horrify anyone who learns it, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the worst horrors are not the work of monsters or demons, but of ordinary people making rational calculations. People who can look at suffering and death and see only numbers on a ledger. People who can sleep peacefully at night, knowing that their comfort and wealth are built on the slow poisoning of other human beings. That is the real horror of the silent quarters. Not that they were haunted, but that they were not. Not that they were the work of some evil supernatural force, but that they were the work of men who kept careful records, who attended church on Sundays, who considered themselves civilized and moral, and who nonetheless chose profit over human life again and again and again. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The truth about Charleston silent quarters is now part of the historical record, preserved in archives and academic studies. But there are still questions that may never be fully answered. How many people died because of the poison clay? How many children grew up with damaged bodies and minds? How many plantation owners knew the truth and chose to ignore it? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you found this tale as chilling as I did, and if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker corners of American history. These are the stories they don't teach in schools, the truths that were deliberately buried. But they matter. They matter because they show us what we're capable of, for better and for worse. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter of America's history.